All right, so we're discussing the second quadrant: belief, faith, behavior, belonging. And again, the group you belong to is going to really affect your beliefs. So yesterday I was talking about the Hinduism and how you can look at things in different perspectives. So for instance, Parashurama. Parashurama is the avatar of Vishnu. He cuts off his mom's head. His mother represents a goddess. And this is the idea, though. Somebody who's let's say maybe a white conservative Christian, he might look at the story of Parashurama and say, see, the Hindus, they have barbaric, vicious, backwards belief systems, and Christian belief system is better. But then a Hindu might look at the Christians and say, no, you guys have stories about that like Lot. He offers to give his daughters to these men who want to come and rape. These men come in Sodom, and Sodom was a very stratified, vicious society, and they wanted to rape and they wanted to kill the people in Lot's household. And Lot offered his daughters in place of his guest. So the Hindus could look at this and say, no, you guys are barbaric. Our myths are not barbaric. And Parashurama was God, so don't blaspheme God. And so then you have these two different people belonging in different groups holding on to rigid belief systems. And again, what's the motivation? Maybe it's just, because these people have fragile egos and they're stuck within the ego boundaries and narrow ego consciousness. Maybe the Christians are looking down on the Indians because they're brown, and they're still looking at things through these superficial categories, and they want to protect the white race because they're stuck within their ego identities. But then the Hindus are looking at the white people and they're saying, no, they're just evil, barbaric Europeans maybe. And again, someone could say this is just genetic Darwinism. These people are holding on to different beliefs in order to perpetuate their own genes and maintain division. But regardless, in the transpersonal perspective, neither one's in the flow because both are holding on to rigid belief systems. Both are, and belief systems are scaffolding for the ego and holding together the ego. And and as a result, because they're confined within this narrow ego boundaries, they're not able to break free of the ego body to the truth, which is a transpersonal contemplation, passion, flowing, knowing, where you're moving beyond the ego boundaries, moving beyond the ego imprisonment, or I should say protective enclosure, because again, the ego is not bad; it's a protective enclosure. Because the reason why there is an ego body is because you can't handle the truth all at once. You need to grow and you need to develop to the point where you can transcend the ego body boundaries to the oneness consciousness, to the flow. Transcend thought and the encapsulation of your thoughts, which are shaped by your ego body. So, for instance, like I said, if you're this white Christian, then you might hold on to the Christian belief system and say the Hindus are wrong, and then the Hindus vice versa. And then they say no, the Muslims are wrong, and all this. But the idea though is all of them are holding on to narrow belief systems. Now, in the transpersonal perspective, both you can look at both belief systems and you can say no, that there's a deeper truth with it. When Parashurama cuts off his mom's head, first off, this could represent Vishnu, the oneness consciousness, transcending the interpersonal dualistic consciousness, which is represented by the mother goddess. It's nothing about women being bad. A liberal's gonna say, oh, this is patriarchal society and it's okay to cut off women's heads. But in the transpersonal perspective, it's not pointing to women being inferior. It's the idea that, yes, in those cultures, they did look upon women as inferior. But in the transpersonal perspective, the woman represents materiality, represents the earth goddess, and Parashurama represents the transcendence, and he cuts off the mother's head, representing the the flow is superior to the flow transpersonal consciousness is superior to the interpersonal dualistic ego consciousness. But then at the same time, also, the reason why he cuts off the mom's head is to take her freer of her thoughts, and the thoughts are shaped by the dualistic ego consciousness, by your ego body, identity. And that's why we have certain thoughts and they're shaped by the protection, and they're shaped by our ego bodies. But then the idea, though, with the transpersonal is that's what he was doing. He cut off her head, and then she's resurrected, though. And the idea is she's resurrected, and now she's transcended the dualistic interpersonal thinking oriented consciousness, ego body consciousness, to the transpersonal consciousness, the oneness consciousness. And now she sees the truth, and she's one with the truth, and not the distorted version, which is being polluted by her ego identity and her desires to see what she wants to see. Maybe she holds on to the identity that she's a woman, and she thinks that women are supposed to be inferior. So then she acts that out, and she sees other women as inferior, and because she's stuck within this cultural matrix that might for maybe historical, cultural, economic, political motive reasons, have created these artificial designations of women are inferior, men are superior. And so she's still within this contaminated vision, the ego vision, but now she's transcended the thinking orientation, the idea that she's a separate ego body, that she's a woman, and now she's free and she's in oneness consciousness. She's transcended the flow, and that's going beyond thoughts to knowing, to illumination, inspiration, to the truth. And that's, I describe that's what people say. A lot of these great scientists and stuff, they'll study a lot and they'll gain a lot of knowledge, but then when they come up with this illuminating insight, it comes from something beyond reason, beyond the rational. They don't even know how they could have come up with it. It comes almost by accident, by surprise, by some sort of higher source. And it can't be understood through rational comprehension how this was resolved, how this insight came, because it comes from something outside of them when they let go and then something hit them, from beyond them, from beyond the ego body. And then you could say the same thing with the Christian idea with Lot when he offers his daughters. People can say, "Oh, this was a patriarch, a liberal. Oh, this is a patriarchal society. This is terrible." Or even like the Hindu. "Oh, yeah, you guys don't treat women well. We don't treat women. Well, yeah, that's true. But you don't treat women well. So don't look down upon us." And or it depends on what group you belong to, what you're going to think. Or maybe a conservative Christian is going to say, "Yes, it's important to put your guest first, and women are inferior, so it was good for Lot to offer his daughters." And it might reinforce his prejudices against women looking at this. But then in the transpersonal perspective, again, maybe this just represents that Lot let go of his attachments. His daughters represent his ego body, his genes. And by offering his daughters over the guest, that shows him transcending his ego body preoccupations, letting go of his own seed. And as a result, he's saved. But I'd have to go. Maybe hopefully ask my grandpa about what the meaning of that would be. But this is the idea with transpersonal psychology. It's you're looking at this stuff through the transpersonal lens and seeing these myths as pointing to the transpersonal consciousness, to this truth consciousness, the oneness consciousness. And then, so we have other examples would be like let's look at some other mythologies and we can see how this could work out. I studied the Hindu mythology and I came up with a lot of ideas with this. So one was like when Shiva cuts off Ganesha's head. Ganesha is very much, he wants to protect his mother Parvati, who gave Ganesha a sort of immaculate conception, and then Shiva wants to see his wife, but Ganesha doesn't know that Shiva's his mom's husband. So Shiva cuts off Ganesha's head. And the idea was maybe Ganesha was too dogmatic, and sometimes people can get very dogmatic and stuck in their belief system. They're trying to do good. They think they're doing good. This is like a religious fanatic, but really they're stuck within the ego body and they're not open to insight. They're not open to the flow. He's not open to Shiva, who's the flow. But anyway, Shiva cuts off Ganesha's head. Well, Ganesha is the god of wisdom. And what this could metaphorically represent is that Shiva, the flow, the oneness consciousness, Shiva is one with Vishnu. The flow is the transpersonal consciousness that's supreme. And wisdom comes from the transpersonal consciousness. So you have to put the transpersonal consciousness first. So that's what Shiva cutting off Ganesha's head represents. And then he puts an elephant head on Ganesha, and that represents wisdom. So Shiva's a god of wisdom. And it's the idea that, or Ganesha's god of wisdom, and the idea that Ganesha was a dogmatic fanatic. But, out of this can come wisdom. He got himself in trouble. People get themselves in trouble when they become dogmatic and fanatics. But the thing is, even Jesus said, either be hot or cold, not lukewarm. So be a fanatic, and you're going to get yourself in trouble. But it's only when you get yourself in trouble that you can recognize the limitations of fanaticism and the entrenchment in dualistic ego consciousness. And maybe that can make you more susceptible and receptive to the truth consciousness, to the flow, the transcendence of the ego consciousness. And that's what the Ganesha's elephant head represents. And then even Ganesha, he rides upon a rat. Now, this could represent the idea of an elephant upon a rat. This is very, symbolic of duality, two opposite things, and it should be the opposite. The rat should ride upon the elephant. But maybe this is breaking people free of conventional dualistic consciousness thinking, rational consciousness, so that maybe they can get to the trans-rational, because the truth is beyond the rational. And insight comes when you transcend the ego body and the ego body thinking conventional consciousness. And that's what Einstein, his insights came from a higher domain. He said, he exhausted all resources. Then when biting an apple, the answer would tap him on his shoulder and say, "Here I am." It didn't come from him. It came when he let go, when he was biting out of the apple, when he let go of the ego body. So then we have Ganesha on top of the rat. But what's interesting too is the rat was a rat who was destroying an ashram. So, and then Ganesha tamed the rat, and then it made the rat its vehicle. And maybe this is the idea too, of this dualistic consciousness can destroy an ashram. It can destroy a temple. And you see people within temples and ashrams and stuff who are very ego oriented and maybe fanatical and maybe a little bit crazy, and and they can really cause a lot of ruckus. They can cause a lot of destruction. But then Ganesha tames that. Wisdom tames that. But anyways, and then there's another story where Ganesha's with Kartikeya, and Kartikeya is the god of war, and Ganesha and Parvati tell or Parvati and Shiva. Shiva, he's a oneness. He's the supreme. He's one with Vishnu. He's the truth. He's the flow. He's the transpersonal consciousness. He tells Ganesha and Kartikeya to do 3 laps around the world. Whoever wins will be the leader among them. So Kartikeya starts flying around the world, but Ganesha takes 3 walks around Shiva and Parvati, who are the whole universe. They are existence. And then Ganesha is made the leader, and Kartikeya ends up leaving. And the idea behind that is just, in a metaphorical meaning, wisdom is greater than war. Ganesha's wisdom, Kartikeya's war. Now, people can look at this in terms of like also the idea that if you look at the mythologies throughout the world, like even in the Bible, you see a lot of times a younger brother will usurp the older brother. But the idea behind that is, some people could say with a liberal might say, yeah, this is the idea that the poor are the greatest. It's the poor people who are the most compassionate because they know what it's like to suffer, and it's the downtrodden who are the superior ones. But that's still ego consciousness. That's still looking at the ego body self and looking at duality and labeling somebody. Okay, he's poor and he's rich, and it's true. Sometimes a rich person can be, or a higher powered person can fall to the temptation of thinking that he's superior and getting entrenched in the ego body, and then he might not work as hard. Kind of like Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan worked so hard because he was cut from his team, he says. So, but if he felt like he was superior, he might not have worked as hard. He might not have had that impetus. But again, somebody can look at these stories of the younger brother usurping the older brother and say, yeah, that's what it's about. But then, a conservative might say, no, that's not what it's about. All we got to do is believe in Jesus, and it's not about wealth. The Bible's not about welfare, and the Bible's not about saying the poor is superior and stuff. But then the transpersonal perspective is, it's breaking you free of dualistic consciousness. The younger usurping the older. That's the opposite of what you would normally expect. And the flow is beyond expectation. The flow is beyond rational thinking, which is the 3rd quadrant. It's moving into the 4th quadrant, transpersonal consciousness, which breaks down the boundaries of conventional thinking, natural, rational consciousness, rational resolution, rational comprehension toward this transcendent insight. It's like when you're playing basketball. If you're in the flow, you're not thinking. You transcended thoughts. You transcended the conventional thinking. And you do things that you couldn't have imagined, that you can't calculate. That's beyond you can't make that happen, but you do it because it's perfect. And what didn't come from you, it came from something higher. It came from the higher harmony. And the more you let go, the more it's idea you let go and you let God, right? So, and in this story we have Kartikeya and Ganesha wisdom is supreme. You have the 2 brothers, and Ganesha's wisdom is supreme to war. But then at the same time, Kartikeya goes to the south of India, and that's where Shiva is. But this is the idea that war, while wisdom's greater than war, you don't want to completely denounce war, because war is a concession. And the idea though is, somebody with dualistic ego consciousness is going to take this and say, oh yeah, war is good, yeah. We're worshiping Kartikeya should be fine, and And yeah, because he wants to confirm his ego consciousness, and that those same type of people would be the people who like UFC, because when they look at like UFC, they see people beating each other up, and they like that because it's confirming, it's a reflection of their software, the reflection of their idea that there's of dualism, of separation, that there's separate people and that they're vying for power, and 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 uh, and that's true. There is that within the dualistic virtual reality world, but you can transcend that world to the flow consciousness. You could transcend the ego consciousness to the flow consciousness, and that's not ignoring that world, or that's not like retreating from that world, but that's transcending that world um, toward the oneness consciousness. But so we have Kartikeya. I mean, he's made people still worship him. People still worship the god of war, and he's still connected to Shiva. But this is the idea that yes, war is sometimes a concession, and this is just the idea. If you go to war, you don't want to be thinking, okay, those people are inferior because they're another nationality, or and they're inferior to us, and because then you're looking at things not as they really are. Like, okay, they're black people, so let's go to war with them, or they're Arabs, so let's go to war with them. All Arabs are inferior. Then you're looking at things in a dualistic perspective. There's individuals in every group, and you have to look at environment, and you have to look at all this stuff. And yeah, it might be true that there are quote unquote Arabs who have dualistic ego consciousness, but is it because they're Arabs? No, it's not in the transpersonal perspective. It's more, it has to do with environment. It has to do with their surroundings, that they haven't cultivated this transpersonal consciousness. So they might still see women as inferior, or they might, not all of them though, but that might be permeate the culture, but we don't want to look down upon them, because that would be dualistic ego consciousness. So sometimes war is necessary, it's inevitable. But the thing is, if you do partake in war or whatever as a concession, it's not something, you don't have to partake in that dualistic, impersonal, predator prey consciousness that permeates and pervades war. But we also don't want to discount war. We acknowledge it as an aspect of reality, and that's the same thing with with the Greek stories, where Venus has sex with the god of war, and she leaves the god of technology to have sex with the god of war. But there's just the idea, Venus is the ego. The sex, she's a goddess of sex, and sex is related to the ego, and the ego is related to war. And also this is also related to technology, but she goes with war. And it's just the idea that yeah, there's a god of war. War is an aspect of reality. It's an archetypal aspect of existence. But it's also something that's not something that this is why you transcend the worship of Kartikeya to the worship of Shiva or Vishnu, because war is mainly still within the impersonal dualistic consciousness, where you get really trapped in narrow consciousness, in the belief that you're a separate ego body self that needs to be protected and promoted, which is an illusion. But with Shiva and Vishnu, when you're in that consciousness of Shiva Vishnu, the oneness consciousness, now you see the truth. You're outside of the interpersonal idea that you're a separate ego body self. You've transcended the limitations of the ego body self, and now you're in the transpersonal. You've transcended the ego, and now you're one with the truth. And you can see things as they really are, and things are not being contaminated by your ego motivations, or your ego engagement. So let's look at like the J witnesses, or like the Mormons. A lot of them, they'll have a lot of they'll be very focused on prepping for disasters and the end of the world. So they'll have storehouses full of food and stuff. So they're very focused on the protection and promotion of the ego body self, and they're really worried about that for the afterlife. So this is focused on the ego body self. So they're still within the interpersonal consciousness. And then you'll see in a lot of these places, you'll find a lot of conflict among people, a lot of interpersonal, dualistic, soap opera drama going on among members, because a lot of it is they're based around self preoccupation, and who's doing the most work to help us get into heaven, and it becomes self preoccupation instead of self transcendence. So, but the idea is you don't want to judge them. So let's say you go to like a cult, and the people are cleaning and stuff, but they're cleaning because they're thinking that they're pleasing God. Well, that's still dualistic ego consciousness. But at the same time, you don't want to judge them because cleaning, any type of work, any type of ritual can help break somebody out of his ego body self. Uh, Takes him out of his ego preoccupations, and now he's doing work. He's performing a ritual, and this can help break him free of his thoughts. Just the discipline of cleaning, and that can help free him of the ego enslavement, and so it can move him from the interpersonal consciousness of being a separate ego body to the transpersonal consciousness of oneness consciousness to truth. So this is why it's important not to judge. Okay, they're J witnesses. Yeah, that they're stuck in a rigid belief system, and they're focused on the ego body self and its protection and promotion. Oh, so let's look down upon them. But if you look down upon them, who knows? Some of them might get into the transpersonal consciousness, whereas you, in the judgmental, attitudinal, emotional, looking down on them, is still stuck in the ego body self, and your vision's still contaminated. And I remember that happened with me when I was looking down upon this guy who had autism, and he was talking about how he was doing all this great work and stuff. And I was wondering if he was being ego oriented. But then my grandpa was saying, no, what this guy's saying is, he's doing a lot of fantastic work despite his quote unquote handicap of autism. And the idea behind that is, whatever handicap you have, or yes, people do have handicaps. Some people have limitations, lower IQs, or maybe some sort of disorder. I don't know. Some of these things do exist within the virtual realm. And the idea though is, but in the flow, you don't let that hold you back, and you make the best of whatever is the situation. And this is the idea of positive thinking. So this is emotion. This is the third quadrant. And the thing about positive thinking is, my grandpa says that there's a difference between right thinking and positive thinking. Someone could be positive thinking, but he's thinking that he's trying to have sex with like 50 women, and that's what his thinking's oriented toward. And then he's still within dualistic ego consciousness framework. He still believes he's a separate ego by himself, and he still probably looks down upon women, sees them as inferior, and still believes there's men and women in all this. Whereas right thinking, as opposed to positive thinking, that's more transpersonal orientation thinking. And yes, being positive can be beneficial because it can raise your level of aliveness. It can if you're positive, it might allow you to interact with people more, and then you can get more information, more insights, and you could have more of a healthy lifestyle if you're positive, as opposed to if you're negative. It's hard to be getting the flow if you're negative, because then you're depressed. And like if you're playing basketball and you're depressed, how are you going to lose yourself? But if you have a higher level of aliveness, a positive attitude and outlook, then you're more likely to lose yourself because you're more uplifted. You have more energy, and when you have more energy, now you're more likely to get free of the ego body. Whereas if you're depressed and feeling inferior, then you're more entrenched within the ego body. And then when you get free of the ego body, that's when you get insight. That's when you get, when you're playing ball, when you can let go and quote unquote let God, right? And everything's perfect. But the idea though with what Lil B makes fun of is sometimes you'll see like the people who are like, oh yeah, like the hippies, like I'm positive thinking, and I don't want anybody around me who isn't positive thinking or who isn't, and then they become judgmental, and that's ego oriented, and they're still stuck within the idea that they're a separate ego body, and that orientation, and then so then they might look upon, let's say poor people or people of color who might be acting more in negative thinking, but they're not seeing that it's not because they're black or because they're people of color or because they're poor or whatever that they're like that. It's because of the environment, and they maybe not there's negative effects within the environment that have restricted their consciousness. But the idea with some of the hippie or the spiritual people is they get it becomes self preoccupation, and they just want attention, and they show how positive they are and how positive vibes they have and stuff, but it's really just self indulgence, and they become sentimentalists, and they're like, oh, like I said, this woman, she on the Facebook, she's always like, oh yeah, oh, I love yourself, you are amazing, you are beautiful, and it's all you, and yourself. But in the flow, the idea what Jesus talks about is, it's not me who does it, it's the Father. He's transcended the self to the Father, to the flow, to the transpersonal consciousness, and he's not stuck in this sentimentalist, oh, me, oh, you are beautiful, oh. Yeah, that might be beneficial to think you're beautiful as opposed to ugly, again, because if you think you're beautiful, then you have less of a likelihood of becoming, retreating within your ego body self and getting stuck and depressed. And if you think you're beautiful, you might have more confidence, and with more confidence, you have more of a likelihood of having a stable ego that you can transcend from, that you can build from, that you can transcend out of. But this focus on, oh yeah, positive, oh, you are, just love yourself, that's all focus on the self, and that's sentimentalism. That's focus on the ego body. And what it does is it creates a reaction where people are like, oh, it's just all self-indulgence and immaturity, and you're just trying to call attention to yourself. And you'll see, like, she'll dress in like provocative clothing, and again, there's nothing wrong with provocative clothing, but what's the mentality behind it? She's trying to call attention to her ego body, and which is an illusion. And there's negative consequences with that, with that type of mentality, and we know what those negative consequences would be. I remember she was talking about, like, oh yeah, I'm against, like, racism, and fuck that, and fuck the racism, but but all the cussing and stuff, that's judgmental. That's judgmental dualistic consciousness, and what that does is it provokes a reaction from other people it invites a reaction with other people with dualistic consciousness. It doesn't necessarily make them react, but somebody else who has dualistic ego consciousness and who is stuck within his ego body is going to react to that. And it becomes a virtual drama. And then you see that with, like, the Fox News people, who are all very, very judgmental, very trapped within the dualistic ego consciousness. And and the rigid beliefs, and then you'll see that too with, like, spiritual people, where they'll be like, oh yeah, everything, all the religions are true, but then they'll also be racist, like, or they'll also they'll be very locked into a narrow ego framework, because yeah, they're saying, like, all religions are true, but they're saying it from a framework where they're trying to show off how woke they are, or how intelligent they are, and how understanding they are, and compassionate, but it's still self-indulgence. And they haven't really transcended the ego body, so people look at it and they say, okay, that's just phony, these people are phony. But again, you don't want to judge, because if you're judging people, but you can discern that. A Christian might judge and go, oh yeah, those people, everything's energy, oh, they're phony, oh, I believe in Jesus, but then he still has the dualistic ego consciousness, and then they have the dualistic ego consciousness. You'll see that, like, at the walks, or like the gay pride parade, where, like, somebody will have a sign, like, I remember I saw a guy with a sign and said something like, oh yeah, making fundamentalist Christians pissed, priceless, and there's a fundamentalist Christian with a sign saying, like, you guys are going to hell. And then, but the idea is, both of them are locked within a dualistic ego consciousness. Both of them are holding on to ego identities, and they believe they're separate ego self. One is holding on to the identity of the Christian, one's holding on to the identity of a gay person. And both of them are still within the ego body and haven't recognized that it's a dream, that the body's an illusion. So they're still stuck within this framework, and they're not open to the truth, to the transpersonal consciousness, to the flow, to the insight. They're still locked within a narrow framework. And then the one more example of this would be, like, let's look at the story of Krishna, where Krishna, there's all the gopis, and the gopis are bathing, and they're naked. They're women, and they're naked. And then Krishna goes and he takes the gopis' clothes, and he hides upon a tree. And then the gopis are like, oh, give us our clothes back. And then you see, like, what group you belong to is going to affect your beliefs. So a fundamentalist Christian is going to look at this and say, oh yeah, this is, evil pagans, they worship this God who's a pervert, or whatever. That's what they might say. And then, like, a Muslim will say the same thing, like, because he belongs to that group. Oh yeah, the Hindus, they worship a pervert God or something. But then the Hindus will be like, no, this is God, and you guys are wrong. And they're all holding on to narrow belief systems. They're not open to insight. So the idea with the transpersonal consciousness is you say, what is the transpersonal meaning of this? Well, maybe what it represents is, well, one, it might be the idea of breaking people out of rigidity. So maybe the Christians and the Muslims are too stuck in a rigid framework of consciousness. Whereas, even with Islam, when we have Muhammad, his wife Aisha was accused of adultery, but then a lot of people who are conservatives would immediately be very concerned and vigilant of their wives committing adultery, and that's why you'll see them covering women's hair and stuff, because they're very focused on protecting and promotion of their ego bodies. So a part of that is making sure that their women are as oppressed as possible and have as much covering and stuff as possible and stuck within their houses as much as possible, so that they can't have a child with another man, because they're so concerned about protecting and promoting their ego bodies and their genes in the future generations. But then we know that leads to problems, and that type of very narrow, restricted consciousness leads to wars. It leads to a lot of fighting. It leads to problems within. It's not uplifting consciousness to the transpersonal consciousness. It's still in a very even impersonal, narrow, dualistic consciousness, and you'll see that within some fundamentalist Christians as well. And maybe this idea with Krishna, this is breaking people out of this. They're having mythologies that are with God and naked women. That could be one way of looking at this. It's breaking people out of the rigid morality framework. But at the same time, another way of looking at this is it could be just completely metaphorical. The clothes can represent your identity. People's clothes, they represent their ego identities. And he's taking their clothes from them. He's taking the women's clothes while they're bathing. And maybe this is helping them break free of the idea that, they're wearing women's clothes. Maybe they're breaking them free of the idea that they're women. Maybe breaking them free of whatever identity. Maybe their clothes represent their caste or their class, and he's breaking them free of these ego identities, so they can break free of the ego body identity to the flow, to the truth consciousness. And and then one more thing I want to say is there's this one passage in the Bible. I forget if it was John or someone who says it in the New Testament. One of the disciples of Jesus says something about like stay away from, or he says something like, don't listen to the vain philosophies of the Greeks or whatever. I forget. But then so a lot of Christians who have narrow dualistic ego consciousness and are holding on to rigid belief systems will say, okay, we have to stay away from philosophy, and we have to stay away from anything that's counter to the fundamentalist Christian message. But the idea behind that is John wasn't a fundamentalist Christian. At that time, they weren't fundamentalist Christians. Fundamentalist Christianity is a new phenomena. And the disciples probably, we don't even know what they believed. The Gnostics, they could have been completely Gnostics. They could have had completely, transcendental consciousness, and we don't know what they really believed or what they really taught. But the idea is actually fundamentalist Christianity and the rigid belief systems of the church is very ego-oriented. That's a vain philosophy. And that wasn't necessarily what Jesus taught. So stay away from those vain philosophies, yeah. If it's, and what vanity is that which is confirming the ego body, the delusion of the ego body. And but again, we don't want to judge. You don't want to judge a fundamentalist Christian. You don't want to judge people, because again, people are at the levels where they're at. And when you judge, then you're confirming the separate ego body. And that's why Jesus says don't judge. That's why the other disciples say don't judge. What else I want to say? And then one more thing I want to talk about. I remember there was this black motivation speaker. I forget his name, but he was very like, yeah, you guys gotta, don't sleep. Just do. But when he was talking, it was kind of judgmental, and he was talking about making it happen. Like, you guys gotta make it happen. You gotta, don't even sleep. Just do. And the idea behind that is, yes, making it happen can the idea is the ego's magnificent in its accomplishments, but it's limited in its reach. So yeah, the motivational speakers, they're appealing to people's egos and trying to make things happen and trying to be great, and that's appropriate at a certain point in people's lives, and that can get you to great. You can achieve great feats through the ego, but at the same time, it's limited. Like when I was playing basketball when I was younger, and I was considered by many the best shooter in the nation, one of the best players in the nation, I wasn't thinking when I was playing. I was I wasn't thinking I gotta score 50 this game. I was just playing. I wasn't even aware of my body. Everything was natural. I wasn't locked into an ego framework, a narrow framework. So, the motivational speaker, he can be appropriate at a certain point, and you can utilize that, but at some point you recognize the limitations of that consciousness and making it happen consciousness, because making it happen gets you in trouble. Somebody's playing basketball and he's trying to make things happen and he's trying to get 50 points that game. Well, he can get in the flow, yeah, but at the same time he can become a ball hog, and he can become too narrow minded, and he can start trying to make things happen and start messing up his footwork and thinking too much. But the idea is, then once you recognize the limitations of that, now hopefully you can break free of that orientation to the flow. And that's just you prepare, you make things possible. You practice, you make your preparations, and then when you get in the game, hopefully you can let go and then be open and receptive to what is most appropriate and most perfect at the moment. And free yourself of the self. But again, the idea is the self can't transcend the self. It only comes by grace. And that's the reason why, Paul says it only comes by grace and by God's grace. You don't save yourself. The self can't save the self. It's God's grace. So this is the idea of transpersonal psychology.